Hello, and welcome back to the 11th installment in a series of videos about the history of Japanese prints and the collection of Japanese works on paper at the Honolulu Museum of Art. I'm Stephen Salel, the curator of Japanese art. Our previous video focused upon Toshusai Sharaku, an enigmatic artist whose portraits of kabuki actors, produced during a 10-month period in 1794 and early 1795, exude emotional intensity. As a prelude to our upcoming discussions about Japan's most celebrated landscape artists, whose work began to appear about a decade after Sharaku's brief career, and whose popularity eventually surpassed that of portraiture, this video will focus upon how the landscape genre developed during the 17th and 18th centuries. Typically, landscapes depicted in Japanese art during this time period were celebrated landmarks, historical sites, beautiful vistas, and tourist attractions. In Japanese, these locations are known as meisho, literally famous places. Several meisho were located around Kyoto and nearby Lake Omi. Guidebooks and perspective prints, meanwhile, frequently featured places in Edo. These types of artworks, in combination with an extremely popular novel that described the Japanese countryside in detail, led to the success of Hokusai, Hiroshige, and numerous other landscape artists in the 19th century. Early examples of meisho can be found in a pair of folding screens that depicts Kyoto from a bird's-eye perspective. This particular painting commemorates an important annual event, the Gion Festival, held in the latter half of July. And as we view the screens from right to left, we notice groups of revelers parading down the streets alongside colorful wheeled floats. Equally prominent in this artwork, however, are Kyoto's landmarks, including Kiyomizu Temple in the upper right corner of the right screen, Nijo Castle in the center of the left screen, and Kinkakuji, the Golden Pavilion, in the upper right corner of the left screen. Similar to the way in which these painters popularized sites in Kyoto, around the 1730s, printmakers began to publish images of the shore surrounding Lake Omi, located slightly to the east. The prints featured here, published in the 1760s, were designed by Suzuki Harunobu, the subject of our 7th video. The series is composed of 8 scenes, inspired by classical poems written in the 15th through 16th centuries, which were in turn based upon Chinese landscape paintings. Harunobu has inscribed the corresponding poem in the upper right corner of each print. The 8 themes in this series are the enormous pine tree at Karasaki, as seen during a nocturnal rainstorm, the snow-covered slopes of Mount Hira in the evening, Ishiyama Temple on an autumn moonlit night, the bell of Mi Temple ringing in the evening, the bridge of Seta glowing in the light of the setting sun, Yabase Harbor, to which sailboats return after long voyages, Owazu, where the weather is clearing after a recent storm, and Katata, where geese gather during their seasonal migration. The 8 views of Omi as this pictorial theme was known, inspired ukiyo-e designers for the following 150 years. Produced alongside these famous sites near Kyoto were similar works that highlighted Meisho in Edo. During the 1660s, for example, shortly after the folding screens we discussed were completed, Asai Ryoi, the author who coined the term ukiyo, published a 7-volume guidebook about the capital. Among the sites Ryoi included in his text were Edo Castle, at the heart of the capital, Nihonbashi Bridge, the bustling main entrance to the city, the open-air theater in Negicho district, where kabuki performances were held, and the Yoshiwara brothel district, whose placement as the final meisho in this guidebook testifies to the popularity that it enjoyed at the time. About 80 years after the release of Asai Ryoi's book, and around the time of Suzuki Harunobu's 8 Views of Omi, other print artists employed novel Western techniques to depict places in Edo. Shortly beforehand, the etchings of Italian landscape artists such as Canaletto entered Japan through the trading port in Nagasaki. In this image, Canaletto uses one-point perspective to show how Venice's Grand Canal and the buildings on either shore seem to diminish as they retreat into the distance until they disappear at a vanishing point on the horizon, which lies slightly below the center of the composition. When those European artworks reached Edo, they inspired Okamura Masanobu to produce his own experiments with linear perspective, which he called uki-e, literally floating pictures. This is Masanobu's perspectival study of Ryogoku Bridge. The architectural structure of the hall in the foreground carefully follows Canaletto's model, but lacking a clear horizon line, those objects beyond the building's furthermost railings, such as the titular bridge on the far left and the distant shore of Sumida River, lose their sense of three-dimensionality. In this work of uki-e, published about 20 years later, Utagawa Toyoharu employs Cartesian perspective far more successfully in his depiction of the Yoshiwara brothel district. Although many Japanese landscape prints feature locales in either Kyoto or Edo, for a period of time, artists focused their attention instead upon the 319-mile-long route that connects these two cities. The origins of the Tokaido Road can be traced at least as far back as the 10th century, but civil war during the first few centuries of its existence made domestic travel treacherous. The road only began to experience frequent traffic in the early 17th century, when the military government situated itself in Edo and unified the country by demanding that the feudal lord of each province, along with his retainers, reside in the capital for half of each year. The city's burgeoning population and its thriving commerce further transformed the Tokaido into a major trade route. 53 towns between its terminal points of Edo and Kyoto were designated as stations, where a traveler could be assured of finding a place to eat and sleep. The 10th station, Hakone, and the 31st station, Arai, also included security checkpoints, and in order to pass through these stations, a traveler needed a visa. In 1690, the print designer Hishikawa Moronobu who we discussed in our second video, published an illustrated map of the Tokaido. The document fills 5 volumes, each of which is bound in accordion style. From the starting point of Nihonbashi Bridge, Moronobu takes us through Shinagawa Station, and Kawasaki Station, all the way to Kyoto. Approximately 100 years later, in 1797, the print designers Kitao Masayoshi and Takehara Shunsensai collaborated with author Akisato Rito to produce a 6-volume guidebook called Pictures of Famous Places Along the Tokaido. In contrast to Moronobu's map, they begin in Kyoto, depicting sites such as the Sanjo Bridge, a folk painting studio in the nearby town of Otsu, Mount Fuji in Suruga Province, modern-day Shizuoka, and Komyo Temple in Edo, at the end of the Tokaido. As domestic travel became increasingly popular, publishers saw more demand for travel-related materials, and soon the publishing industry and travel industry found themselves in a deeply interdependent relationship. This symbiosis was most apparent around 1802, when the book Along the Tokaido on Shanks Mare, a novel by Jipensha Iku, began serialization. Shanks Mare portrays Kitahachi, nicknamed Kita, and Yajirobe, also known as Yaji, dishonorable yet comical citizens of Edo whose wanderlust propels them down the highway and whose misfortunes and foolishness lead to adventures along the way. The commercial success of Shanks Mare not only catapulted Japan's travel industry to new heights, it arguably launched the careers of several landscape artists, including Hokusai and Hiroshige. It is worth noting, however, that the original edition of Shanks Mare was illustrated almost entirely by Iku himself. Unlike the landscapes in Asai Ryoi's guidebook to Edo, Iku's images were far more abbreviated, gestural, and painterly. Reminiscent of Harunobu's 8 Views of Omi, many of Iku's illustrations are distant views of the countryside, with the blank sky filled with short poems and commentary. In contrast to these distant shots, other illustrations by Iku are intimate scenes of Kita and Yaji traveling down the highway. In their style and composition, several of these images herald the work of Hokusai, as well as that of Hiroshige. More generally, the conventions of landscape art presented here, the serialization of prints under themes such as the 8 Views of Omi, the integration of Western perspective into traditional Japanese imagery, and the promotion of locations as meisho, would come to define the work of Hokusai, Hiroshige, and various other Japanese landscape artists active in the first half of the 19th century. In our next video, we will discuss Hokusai's early depictions of the Tokaido and the ways in which his career developed over the following decades.